Good evening and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. Many of you have asked about the painting which is shown in the titles of this program. And here it is. It's a small painting at the Frick by a French 18th century artist, Jean-Siméon Chardin. And it is a very simple painting, but at the same time, very complexly and beautifully painted. I'm matching this painting with a similarly simple yet wonderful cocktail, which is actually one of my favorite of all time. And this is a very straightforward Gin Martini with a twist of lemon. Cheers. Chardin's still life arrived at the Frick Collection in a very tumultuous time. It was acquired by trustees in 1945, the end of the Second World War. It was acquired from the dealer Wildenstein. This is not a painting which belonged to Frick, and it was one of the many paintings, almost half the collection now, was acquired after Frick's death. The trustees from the 1920s till the whole sort of post-war period bought a large quantity of mainly paintings, and then acquisitions subsequently have focused mostly in different areas, with the occasional painting being acquired or donated to the Frick. Henry Clay Frick liked to live with paintings that he could live with. And we've talked about this before, but if you go to the Frick collection, you will realize very quickly that the collection doesn't have any paintings showing violence, showing particularly erotic scenes, showing anything in any way disturbing. And Frick liked to surround himself, not surprisingly, with landscapes and with portraits of people. I always wonder about this, and I wonder about the fact that he was clearly very interested in having people around him. And I imagine him and his family and the staff in the house being surrounded by all these faces every day. What always surprised me is that he never collected still lifes. So out of the entire collection, Frick did not buy a single still life. When this was acquired in 1945, it was one of the smallest paintings in the collection, but also the only still life. That is not the case anymore because we do have a number of them, some of which are actually works on paper. But the only other painting, which is a still life, is a much later gift, which came to us in 2012. And this was a gift from the great collector Asbjørn Lunde, who passed away a few years ago. And he left this Dutch still life. He gave this Dutch still life to the Frick. This is by a little-known Dutch artist called Gerard van Spendonk. And it is, again, a very small work showing this sort of bunch of grapes with flies and various insects on them, sitting on a ledge of marble. And what is really wonderful about this painting when you next look at it is that it is actually painted on a marble slab. So the support for this painting is marble. But this Chardin is painted on canvas, and we've talked in these programs about 18th century art. 18th century art is so important at the Frick. We've talked about Boucher's great paintings at the Frick. We talked about the lady on her daybed. We've spoken in an episode of Travels with a Curator about Watteau's soldiers at Valenciennes, at the portal of Valenciennes. We spoke about the Fragonard room. Fragonard, Boucher, Watteau are all some of the great, great painters active in 18th century France. But Chardin is also one of them, but he is in many ways a lesser known, more modest artist in that sort of pantheon of great figure painters of that period, and an artist who was really much appreciated later in his life. Here he is in a self-portrait at pastel from 1775 at the Louvre in Paris, where he stares at us with these wonderful spectacles and this visor he's wearing on his forehead. There are a number of pastels of Chardin showing him along these same lines. Chardin is an artist who didn't travel much, didn't move much, didn't have a very exciting life or career. He was born in 1699, at the very end of the 17th century, on the 2nd of November. And so one of the reasons I would like to talk about him today is also that last week, around the time of Halloween, it was actually his birthday. So Chardin is born at the turn of the century and lives well into the 18th century. He dies aged 80 in 1779. Most of his career is devoted to painting genre scenes and still lifes. Now, when you think of the great painters of the 18th century, most of them aspired to become court painters, most of them aspired to become academicians. And the way to do that, which is true of Boucher and Fragonard, for example, was to paint large paintings, large cycles of paintings, which sometimes were turned into tapestries, were acquired by the crown, by the royal family, and then producing grand mythological scenes of one kind or another. Fragonard started that way. He ended his career in a different direction. Boucher very much worked along those lines. Watteau developed a different type of painting with his fête galante and his small, beautiful paintings. But Chardin really occupies a very different place in that group of artists. He was largely self-taught. He worked with a number of other painters. He studied, for example, with Coipel at the beginning of his career. But he developed something that other people were not really doing. And in the grand scheme of the hierarchy of painting at the time, clearly not a hierarchy we would understand in the same ways today, history, mythological paintings were at the top of that scale, with portraiture and landscape sort of following, but still life and genre scenes were often considered the lowest level of painting. And Chardin really focuses on those. Now, we know him for his genre scenes, and there are many of which were also repeated in a number of variants. So often you could see the same scene by Chardin in a number of different collections and museums. Just to give you a few examples here, this is the boy blowing bubbles in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. But some of the more famous ones are also, for example, the young schoolmistress at the National Gallery in London. These very stark backgrounds with these figures beautifully painted in front of them and sort of jumping out in front of the viewer. Possibly the most famous is the card player, which exists in a number of versions. This is the one, again, at the National Gallery in London. One of the more beautiful versions is at Waddesdon Manor, the Rothschild home house in the countryside between sort of London and Oxford. But the series of paintings, a number of different paintings, were reunited in a really wonderful exhibition at Waddesdon a few years ago. The still lives are what we're interested in, because obviously the only still life, the still life we have at the Frick is, of course, by Chardin. We also have a genre scene by him, but which was also acquired later on and was not acquired by Frick. Some of these still lifes could be fairly large in format. This is one of the grandest ones, is the so-called ray, because of the ray fish that you see at the center of this, with the cat and other fish and a number of bottles and tools and instruments against this wall. This is now at the Louvre in Paris. And a number of others show very prosaic, very simple objects. And what is really wonderful about these paintings is, on one hand, the simplicity of the depiction of these objects combined with the incredible beauty, the sort of poetic feeling of them. You start looking at each one of them and you can feel the texture, the surfaces of the different things, of the drinks, of the porcelain, of the fabric, of the wood, of the stone. And remember, these are all usually fairly small. I find myself going around museums and always stopping in my tracks and being enchanted by Chardin's still lifes. He didn't paint very much. It's been argued that he painted only a couple of hundred paintings in his career, in his fairly long career. That is an average, it's been said, of about 4 or 5 paintings a year. He painted very, very slowly. We don't know who a lot of his patrons were. There were some of the aristocrats, collectors of the day, but clearly there were people who had a very refined and very unusual taste, not the collectors that were acquiring the grand mythological portraits, mythological scenes or portraits. This is one of my all-time favorite still lifes by Chardin. It's a still life with a glass of water and a coffee pot. This is at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And when you look at it, it's really a rather random collection of objects. You have this full glass of water with this sort of beautiful transparency, the coffee pot to the right, and then you have garlic and flowers on a ledge. These are all objects that don't necessarily go together in any way. They're sort of leftovers from a kitchen. You get the feeling that someone has just taken things out of a dining room and put them on a ledge as a dinner is over. And these are the leftovers of that dinner, somehow left for the sharp eye of Chardin to focus on. The other amazing thing about these still lifes is the way they're painted. I mean, Chardin is an extraordinary magician at using paint. We haven't talked a lot about the technique of artists in these programs, and part of that is because I feel strongly that to really understand the technique and understand how something is painted, you need to look at the original. It's difficult for me to show you that on a screen through the internet. But trust me, when you look at a Chardin still life, every single brushstroke is there for a reason. And look at the way in which the light is reflected, refracted, bounces off these objects, the coffee pot and the glass of water. And the transparency of that glass of water is absolutely magical. Now, our still life, of course, is exactly an exercise in this. And I've spent a lot of time looking at this and looking at how these objects, again, seem to be randomly grouped on this ledge. There is a stone ledge on which the objects are placed. It is signed at the bottom right. You see Chardin's surname. And you get three groups of objects. On the left, a basket with some fruit. On the right, some vegetables. And in the middle, the bottle and the glass. Now, how do these objects all come together? And again, there is no reason why these objects are together. On the left, you have a basket, a woven basket with plums. And what I love about these plums is that you get that feeling of plums that have just been plucked from a tree with that slightly dusty covering of the skin of the plum. These haven't been washed yet. They have that sort of countryside feeling to them of fresh fruit that just came into this house from the outdoors. On the right, you have squashes, two large squashes. And again, each brushstroke, look at the light brushstrokes, the white, the bright orange, the yellow, they are almost, if you focus on it and go very, very close, like an abstract painting. He's putting these touches together. And yet when you step back, again, it gives you that rugged feeling of the surface, the skin of a squash. And then you have a bottle and a glass. So you go from the vegetable kingdom in a way, somewhat to the mineral kingdom through the magic of glass. And both of these glasses, one is transparent, one is dark, show what is in them. So the glass is not quite half full, half empty. It's mostly full, let's be positive. But the one in the background, the bottle, you can just about see halfway through it that it does contain some liquid. Probably wine, probably white wine, but it may be water. It may be a bottle that has been reused for water, and that is where the water in the glass comes from. We don't know. Again, why are these objects together? This is not part of a recipe. You're not going to cook anything with squash, plums, and water. I mean, maybe you can. I'm not sure what that would be. I'm not sure I want to try it. But this is the artist going to the market or sending someone to the market and just representing miracles of nature and everyday prosaic objects literally under a new light. Look at the way the light bounces off those dusty plums, off the surface of the squash, off the bottle of wine and the glass. Look at the way the light reflects the room in which we are, the viewer are, onto those two surfaces and how we see through them against this wall. The color of the stone ledge and the color of the wall are almost effectively the same. So you are in this very abstract space. And what Chardin is doing is pausing you and making you look at these objects very, very carefully. For a long time, it was believed that our still life at the Frick was actually dependent of another still life, which is in Switzerland. This is the still life on the left, the still life with peaches, grapes, and a pear, which is in the Oscar Reinhardt collection in Winterthur in Switzerland. This is somewhat near Zurich. It's another great house collection up in the mountains. It's an incredible place, great collection of Impressionist paintings and old masters with 3 wonderful Chardin still lifes and a number of other great works. But when these two were in the same collection, the collection of Léon Michel Lévy, they were sold in 1925, they were believed to be together, to be pendants and to have been conceived as pendants. And you can see that they have similar stone ledges. They're both signed, one on the right, one on the left. But in fact, they are slightly different in size. The one at Winterthur is quite a bit smaller than the one at the Frick. And it turns out, of course, that they both came originally from different collections. So we're fairly sure now that even though these two paintings have been associated with one another, they have nothing to do with each other. They're also from different periods in Chardin's life. The one in Winterthur probably quite a bit later. Ours is probably a fairly early work from the late 1720s, early 1730s. Even though often with Chardin, it's difficult to date these works, our still life was also dated much later to the 1750s, 1760s. But so back to our still life, I think the textures of these objects and the wonderfully poetic way in which these are assembled together, the idea that the plums are in this basket over this stone surface, and yet one plum has slipped out of the basket and it's almost sort of rolling towards us. The squashes are set one on top of the other, and the glass of water is above them, reflecting them through and against the surface of the glass. These are paintings that don't have a deep meaning immediately. They're not paintings that show a complicated mythological story. They're not paintings where you have to know who the sitter is. There isn't a huge story behind them. But this doesn't mean they're lesser paintings, they're inferior paintings. Quite the opposite. I think what these paintings do is they stop us. We're living at a time like no other time that many of us has lived through, at least people of my generation and younger. And what this is doing, what the pandemic is doing, what is happening in the world is doing, is stopping us. And it's making us pause and look around ourselves, focus on what is important and what is not important in our lives. And suddenly, everything that is around us, we have more time for that. We're not rushing. We're not rushing to get to work, to get to the subway, to do what we do every day. And I would like to encourage you all in a way, when you're not able to go to a museum, when you're not able to come to the Frick, actually just look at a dish of grapes, look at some mushrooms, look at a potato in your kitchen, and you will realize that looking at these objects in a specific way, you understand so much about nature, about the nature that is there to nourish us and that is there to support us in many ways as human beings. All of the objects in this painting, the squash, the plums, the water, possibly the wine, are there to provide nourishment for us. Not surprisingly, Chardin, I believe, was one of the artists in the 18th century who was well ahead of his time. One of the reasons why maybe he wasn't considered so highly as opposed to Boucher, Fragonard, or Greuze, or Watteau, was the fact that he was, in many ways, more modern than them. Think this is the time where in the 1720s, 30s, 40s, 50s, time of Rococo, time of these great sort of frolicking scenes, time of the 1770s, the time of the Fragonard room. Instead, here is this artist painting these scenes of everyday life, everyday objects. These will be, of course, hugely influential to Picasso, to Braque, to Morandi in Italy, to all the great painters of still lives that lived in the later 19th, early 20th and 21st century. When Chardin died, it was said that one of the things he had said as a painter when he was alive was, "Who said one paints with colors? One employs colors, but one paints with feeling." And I think it's so true when you look at a Chardin still life, that there is so much feeling in these works and not just paint. Again, not surprisingly, Chardin was one of the favorite artists of the great writer Proust. And whenever I think of the great scene in Proust, in the first volume of the Recherche, the famous scene of the Madeleine dipped in a cup of tea, and how that simple moment recalls a whole world, recalls a whole life of a human being, I feel that this is exactly the same. Looking at a Chardin still life, that's sort of what you get. And I suspect that Proust, when describing these rather prosaic objects like a cup of tea and a cookie and a biscuit and a Madeleine, is thinking very much about the work of Chardin. So I hope that this evening, in the complication of the world we live in, and with everything that is going around in our world, in history, in our country, in our city, I hope you can all pause for a few minutes and think about some of the beauties of life, of nature, and especially of art. And I raise my Gin Martini to you once again. Thank you.